So No Man's Land is a movie I'd seen before, and I remembered really, enjoying is probably a strong word because it's pretty dark, but thinking it was really good, and it is really good. And I definitely remember some key things, but also never really fully understood the conflict that it is set in.
Yeah, this is my first time watching it, and doing the research for this episode, this is probably one of the more complicated geopolitical situations that we've had so far, and especially because it's only I have this huge page of notes, all these things that, happened in this area during this time frame. And it's only from 1980 to 1999. And it's just an insane amount of stuff.
Right. You could even look at just 90 to 94, 95, and it would be a really long list. Yeah.
Right.
And part of me wonders too, because this is exceedingly complicated, and we'll try our best to kind of simplify it for everyone, including ourselves. But I wonder to what extent, because we've been saying that more and more. So I'm trying to think, is it that all these modern conflicts are that much more complicated? Or is it just because they're more recent, we are more aware of the nuance involved? And you could surely break down Genghis Khan into just as many nuances, especially if you had better, records from the time to actually understand all the geopolitics that weren't necessarily at play, or that we weren't necessarily aware of. They were probably just as heavily at play.
I think it's a mixture of both,
right?
Because I think one, it's kind of a recency bias thing, but also because recording things was so much easier and was so much more common now in the modern times. This conflict is informed a lot by World War II and even World War I in a way that wouldn't necessarily trickle down in an ancient conflict, or if it did, it would just take a lot longer.
Right. That's fair. And I do want to give a quick rundown of the situation, which basically centers on the former nation of Yugoslavia. So
yes,
Yugoslavia first emerged after World War I with kind of the collapse of Austria-Hungary, and also it took some territories to the southeast of that as well. And then it existed through World War II, when it was actually under the control of the Axis during World War II.
The Nazis and the Italians both controlled different parts of it.
Yes. And so following World War II, kind of a big national hero for the Yugoslavians was this, I forget his first name, but this Tito fellow who was a kind of USSR buddy. So following the end of World War II, they're able to reestablish Yugoslavia, basically in what it was before the war, but now it's communist and controlled by this Tito guy who's buddy with the USSR. And ultimately, though, Yugoslavia, even right after World War I, was this collection of 6 separate groups, which are going to ultimately lead to part of the problem. So they're going to be names you kind of recognize because they're, spoiler alert, they're all kind of their own thing today.
They're all separate countries now.
Right. So those 6 countries that were all part of Yugoslavia are Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is, again, technically one, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. So things you've heard, but there's a reason those countries weren't at the Olympics until recently, because they were all part of Yugoslavia. And so basically, through 1980 and even after, Tito did a good job of not letting any nationalistic sentiment within any of those individual countries build to a boiling point, and he just kind of always preached that, hey, we are in this together, we are one Yugoslavia, and let's have pride in that as opposed to our separate little groups.
And it's kind of like what we saw in Afghanistan a couple episodes ago, where it's a kind of a good and a bad. So he was keeping the nationalist sentiment in these ethnic groups to a minimum, but that was because anytime there was even a little bit of rebellion, he would just go and stomp it out, basically keeping the country peaceful by force.
Right. Or like we saw with Saddam Hussein, where once he was gone, the power vacuum.
Right, exactly.
Although this guy was probably a little more, even though, yes, he was ruthless at times, seemed to be a little more popular than, say, a Saddam might have been in Iraq.
Yeah, and I think actually, not anymore, but there was even a city in Montenegro named Titograd after President Tito. It's not named that anymore, but
okay, but they've since renamed it.
Yeah.
So he did die in 1980, and what's kind of interesting is for the most of the 80s, even though he was gone, they kind of mostly carried on as if he was still there. Like his presence still kind of loomed over Yugoslavia. And it wasn't until what we've been talking about in recent weeks with the collapse of the Soviet Union and communism in other countries that then communism started to collapse within Yugoslavia as well.
This is kind of a different situation, though, because Yugoslavia was not part of the Soviet Union. Like, they were communist, but they were not part of the
But
Soviet
neither was Romania.
No, right. But they were specifically actually like one of the founding members of the non-aligned movement, which is a group of countries that was like, we are not going to be with the West or with the USSR. We're going to be our own separate thing. And it's actually still around today. And after the UN, it's the international organization with the most members.
Okay, so even though Romania was a separate country, it was a lot more aligned with the Soviet Union, even politically, than Yugoslavia was.
Right.
Okay.
Yugoslavia was not aligned with the Soviet. They initially were after World War II because of Tito and his connections with Stalin.
Okay.
But they actually during the Cold War they were neutral, and they they were part of this non-aligned movement.
Would that be the only European communist country that would probably fall under that category then, with the others all being kind of aligned with the Soviet Union? Like East Germany and Romania were a lot more buddy-buddy with the Soviet Union?
So it looks like most of the countries in the non-aligned movement, so we're like the only European countries. The rest of the member nations are like African countries, Middle Eastern countries, India, Afghanistan, Pakistan.
Okay.
A few countries in South America.
Okay.
Because pretty much the rest of, Europe West was aligned with, the United States, and the eastern part of Europe was with the USSR, with the Iron Curtain.
Yeah. So basically what kind of set everything up for the powder keg to explode was, again, the Communist Party within Yugoslavia collapses, the economy tanks, and then the nationalism that Tito was able to suppress now is at a high pitch in all 6 areas. And so it was only a matter of time before everything just went to hell. And that's basically exactly what happened, that you just have all the ethnic groups. And it's also complicated, too, because, to say the least, because within each of these 6, future countries here, well, there's also ethnic overlap. And it's like, okay, so this country is mostly this, but there's also a lot of, Serbians in Bosnia. And there's a lot of, and it's just so much overlap.
And that's where pretty much all of the conflicts arise, is because of the, ethnic groups wanting autonomy in these different countries. And yeah, I mean, it all kind of started, well, in 1986 when Slobodan Milosevic, who was eventually the president of Serbia, but he was, at that time, he was a leader of what was called the Serbian League of Communists. So there was the League of Communists in Yugoslavia, and then each country had its own representative in this league. And then there were 2 autonomous zones in Serbia, Vojvodina and Kosovo, that each had members as well. But in 1986, Slobodan Milosevic basically had this support and of these protests, and it was called the Rallies of Truth. And they overthrew the independent leaders in Vojvodina and in Kosovo and in Montenegro. And with those leaders overthrown, basically pro-Serbian rulers were established there. And so that was kind of like the beginning of the end for the League of Communists and really for Yugoslavia as a whole, because then in 1990, they had the last meeting and it kind of eroded because...
Is that the one they all walked out of?
Yeah, so the Serbs wanted to stay unified, and then the Slovenes wanted to... they were like the ones that were really pushing to have all the countries be autonomous. And so it started with the Slovenes, and then the Croats walked out. And basically the whole thing, it was like, all right, this is the end of this. Which then, not that long after, just a few months after, in 1991, all 6 of those countries held multi-party elections. And that was when Croatia and Slovenia both they held referendums and actually declared independence from Yugoslavia, which was then kind of the impetus for the first armed conflict in the region, which was the 10-Day War. And it was basically Serbs in Croatia. They kind of got nervous because going back to World War II, Croatia was its own independent country, even though it was, Axis powers that occupied it. It was its own country, and there was a Croatian, like a group of nationalist Croats that aligned themselves with the Nazis, that started to basically persecute and commit violence against ethnic Serbs in Croatia, and even did genocide against them, just like the Holocaust. It was actually part of the Holocaust. They were actually sent to concentration camps and stuff. So they were kind of these, the ethnic Serbs in Croatia. I mean, that was only not even 50 years before this that we're talking about today. And so it was kind of fresh in their minds. And so they didn't want to be part of Croatia. They wanted to be part of Serbia because they wanted that ethnic solidarity.
So is the sad reality, if the various ethnic groups were more concentrated within their respective countries, that we might have just been able to simply divide the borders and it would have been basically a non-violent separation? And the overlap is what caused all the issues?
Maybe, because the same thing. So you have the 10-Day War, which is Yugoslavia invading Slovenia after they declared independence. And then you have the Bosnian War, which is, again, when I'm talking about Serbians in the Bosnian War, it's not like Serbians from Serbia, it's ethnic Serbs in Bosnia.
Right.
So it's all these countries are a mix, and there's not even, like in Bosnia, there isn't even a ethnic group that is a majority.
Oh, right. The biggest group is like the 44% of the Muslim Bosnians or whatever, right? Yeah.
Right. There's Bosniaks, 44% are Bosnian Muslims, but then 30% are Serbs, and 17% are Croats. And they basically all wanted to control their own little areas. And so you have, the Croatians are supporting the Croats. The Bosnians are
trying to assert their own authority.
Kind of have to assert their own authority over their own country. And the Serbs have the backing of Serbia.
Oh, wow. It's interesting, too, is this actually is starting to get to the first topics we've even had in this whole project that I remember, at least peripherally, at the time. So, like, mid-90s, well, I'm in high school when this stuff's going on, or middle school when it's beginning. But even the name Slobodan Milosevic, I'm like, oh, yeah, I remember that, because, like, Saturday Night Live would end up parodying or mention it, or just be on the evening news. Just the name Slobodan Milosevic is something like, oh, wow, that's like, I remember back to, 25 years ago hearing that name a lot. And then the Bosnian War, which you already mentioned, I kind of wrote in my notes here that it's almost like a war that broke out in the middle of a war.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just, crazy complicated, which again does now bring us to our movie today, which doesn't deal with specific things. And ultimately, honestly, even though we've just been talking about this whole dissolution of Yugoslavia, it's more of just an anti-war film that could be set in any conflict and just happens to take place during this one. But we do see, and so let's kind of set it up.
The movie takes place in 1994. We actually know that because there's a part in the movie where it's going back and forth between, you see like the Bosnian lines and the Serbian lines. And I think it was one of the Bosnians is reading a newspaper and he goes, "Man, it's a shame what's going on in Rwanda."
Yes.
So we know that this takes place concurrently with Hotel Rwanda in 1994.
Yes, which is probably the first time that's ever happened for us in this project, other than like when we're doing World War II movies and then another World War II movie, that's different. But this is two completely separate topics that are happening concurrently, and the movie itself even gives you that clue, which is definitely interesting.
Right. And so we know, based on the newspaper article and then the fact that the UN guys are there, that this is like 93, 94, because the UN wasn't initially involved. So just to kind of give a little background to this actual conflict. So we talked about before how there's the three major ethnic groups in Bosnia: the Bosniaks, the Serbs, and the Croats, and in that order for, how big they are. So 40-ish% Bosniaks, 30-ish% Serbs, and about 17% Croats. While all of these countries were having these votes for independence, Bosnian Serbs said, well, we don't want Bosnia to attempt to get its independence. We want to remain part of Yugoslavia. But Bosnia-Herzegovina held a referendum anyway, and it was like 99-point-something% voted to leave. That's because all of the Bosnians and Croats voted to leave, but the Serbs all boycotted the election.
Right.
So the day after that vote took place, there was a Serb that was killed by a Bosniak. Like this, a murder basically happened. So the Bosnian Serbs used that as an excuse to occupy Sarajevo and set up roadblocks throughout the city. And basically exerted military control over Sarajevo, which is the capital, and said, Bosnia and Herzegovina is not going to be its own country. We're going to remain part of Yugoslavia. Well, actually, I take that back. They didn't want to remain part of Yugoslavia. They wanted to set up their own country called the Republic of Srpska.
Oh, right. Yeah, I saw those maps. Yeah.
Yeah, and then they also wanted, they absorbed, so all of the Bosnian Serbs that were in the Yugoslav military, they said, now you're in the Bosnian Serb military. So they basically got their own army as well. And then, so on April 27th, 1992, that was when the what was called the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which was those 6 countries that we talked about before, they had a new constitution and they became the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which was only Serbia and Montenegro. So Bosnian Serbs took control of the Serb majority areas in Bosnia and then started mortar attacks on Sarajevo, and that city was basically shelled on a regular basis for over 3 years, almost 4 years, which is all these forces are under the command of a guy named Ratko Mladic, who actually wasn't arrested for war crimes until 2011.
And Sarajevo then is why that's why that city is so seared into my memory, because just hearing it on the news for 3 straight years over and over and over again, more from Sarajevo, more in Sarajevo. Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, and they were, shelling areas that they knew were going to be populated heavily by civilians. So they would shell like markets. They would shell. So they cut off all of the main water supply to the city, and then the UN set up like water points, like water collection points, and then they would shoot mortars at them and try and kill as many civilians as possible. And it was literally thousands of civilians killed throughout the course of this war.
Right. This conflict is kind of famous for just war crimes after war crimes on both sides, and everyone was just like, no, we don't care about any rules of engagement. Like, it's just war crime city going on here.
Yeah. So then, while all of this is going on, at the same time, we had talked about the Croats before being the other. The main conflict here is between the Serbs and the Bosniaks, but the Croats we also mentioned before.
It's kind of like the third party in Bosnia.
Yeah. Right. They were initially aligned with the Bosniaks, like, hey, we're going to help you. We have this common enemy in the Serbs. They want to, they're trying to turn us into this Republic of Srpska. Well, as the war kind of continued, Croatia began to get stronger militarily. So then the Croats then basically said, all right, Bosniaks, you're on your own. We want to set up our own country called the Croatian Republic of Herzegovina. And they got backing from Croatia, who also was then invading the Serb majority controlled areas of Croatia and kicking Serbs out back to Serbia. And they were like, so there were Serbian villages that had existed in these areas for centuries, like hundreds of years. And the Croats went in, kicked all the Serbians out, and then would completely destroy the villages, just burn them to the ground so that they wouldn't come back. So that was all going on at the same time that this is going on. So that was kind of when the UN came in and declared all Muslim areas or areas that were Bosniak, they declared them safe areas. And they devised this plan, or the West devised a plan called the Vance-Owen Plan. And basically the plan was, all right, we're going to divide the country up into 10 provinces, 3 for Bosniaks, 3 for Serbs, and 3 for Croats. And then 1 is going to be like a neutral area for Sarajevo, the capital. Not dissimilar from how like Israel is set up, where you have like areas for Israel and areas for Palestine, and then Jerusalem is supposed to be like a neutral zone.
Right.
Basically, they were going to try to do the same thing. But the Serbs said, well, why would we do that when we already control over 2/3 of the country? We would have to give up a bunch of our territory that we've already conquered to put that plan into effect. And we're the strongest, military force here. So why would we do that? And so that plan kind of broke down. Even though the Bosniaks and the Croats were both on board, the Serbs didn't want to give up the required land to put that into effect. So then we get into 1994 when you actually get the NATO intervention, basically because it's kind of like a trading of jabs between the Bosnian Serbs and NATO forces. So like the Bosnian Serbs, they mortared a market, killed like 60-something civilians. So then NATO said, you need to take all of your artillery and mortars away from Sarajevo within 10 days. And the Serbs said, no, you can't make us. We refuse. You can't bully us west. So they conducted some airstrikes against a command post, which then the Serbs responded to by mortaring a hospital. And then they captured a bunch of UN peacekeepers. And then they perpetrated what was called the Massacre of Srebrenica, which was a UN safe zone. It was a whole town, and the Bosnian Serbs went in, and they initially said that they were going to let everybody go, but then they just murdered like 8,000 people and buried them in mass graves. I mean, it's like the worst genocide to happen in Europe since the Holocaust.
Oh, wow.
And so that was when NATO then said, all right, gloves are off, and started basically this huge bombing campaign against the Serbs, which is kind of what turned the tide in favor of the Bosniaks.
And I have in my notes here that the NATO bombing wasn't even with proper approval, that they kind of did it, but didn't have the full backing of the UN when they did it, or I don't know. Basically, it was almost like they overstepped their bounds when they started bombing.
Yeah, it's kind of like the opposite of what happened in Rwanda. Basically, genocide, and they said, all right, we don't really, we're going to kind of take some shortcuts here, probably, do these bombing campaigns that aren't, we don't have all of the proper approvals that we probably need, but there's genocide happening, like thousands of civilians being murdered. By the day, the body counts grow higher.
We don't have time for approval. Kind of thing, yeah.
Right, so let's just kind of get this over with.
And then I guess, what's the relationship with all this going on between the UN and NATO? They're basically two independent organizations, but with similar interests that are both wanting to help.
Right. Well, NATO is all Western powers, basically.
Right, whereas the UN is more worldwide. Okay.
Right. And the UN is pretty much every country in the world. So the UN was there at, humanitarian and peacekeeping mission, whereas NATO is actually, it's an actual military alliance. So the UN, they have not really military forces, but it's more paramilitary forces. They're armed, but they're not there to, fight battles or conduct combat operations. Basically, their job is to do what we see them do in the movie, like humanitarian stuff, rescuing people, getting them help.
Whereas NATO has fewer people to ask and can get involved quicker without...
Right. Yeah, because it's only a military organization formed after World War II, basically to be the alliance of all these Western nations against the Soviets. Okay. So here you have them coming together to help the Bosniaks by doing bombing campaigns against the Bosnian Serbs.
Which we don't see NATO at all in the movie, unlike the UN, which we do see.
Right.
And so my note here I wrote was that mostly the U.S. presence is all talk, because they're not able to actually to do as much as they would like to do, because kind of like you said, Serbia just says, we don't care what you're saying. So, again, the movie itself could be set during any conflict, but they create a scenario in which, in this trench that looks very reminiscent of a trench you would have seen during World War I, and you end up with a Bosniak and a Serb are in this trench together, and it's actually kind of interesting. So first I kind of forget the order here, and actually, remind me too, I actually wrote it down here. The bald guy is the Serb, and then the guy with the Rolling Stone shirt is the Bosnian. Yeah. So the Serbian comes in with an older guy, and they booby trap this, what they believe is a corpse, and they notice a gun, and they are just checking it out, see if anybody's been here. Meanwhile, the Serbian guy is hiding, and he grabs the gun when they're not looking, and then they notice the gun is gone, and so he actually shoots both of them, kills the older Serbian, and then the younger bald Serbian is shot in the stomach, and the Bosnian guy had earlier been shot in the shoulder, so they're both injured, and then about this time, as they're kind of at a stalemate, they realize that the Bosnian corpse on the ground that has a mine under him is actually alive, and he now can't move, because if he moves, it's a mine that basically, once you press it down, it's engaged, which his body weight has done that. And if he moves at all, it'll release that pressure and detonate the bomb, which they say is this bouncing mine that will basically destroy everything within a 50-yard radius. So killing everybody in the trench, including the guy the bomb's on top of. So the movie is really about that situation. how do we get this guy to safety? How do we let the UN know or both sides know? Because we're basically in no man's land, hence the title of the film. And they don't want either side to kill the other one. So at one point, the Serbian guy even wants to escape with the UN, and the Bosnian literally shoots him in the back of the leg, so he has to stay. So the Serbians don't start shooting, attacking their location. Ultimately, it's an anti-war film, just kind of dealing with the futility of all these conflicts, and then the guys even are arguing literally at gunpoint over whose side started the conflict. And honestly, I guess as a viewer and doing the research, we would have to say, yeah, you're both probably right, and you both suck. It's the, like you said, the Reddit thread or whatever, the everybody sucks here situation.
Yes, and I love movies like this where, you have this huge, super complicated, big geopolitical mess of a war, and instead of making a movie about all of the, the big, from a top down look, it's just this little kind of very human, small interaction between these three guys, and to them really none of the rest of the war even really matters. They're just trying to get out of this trench without getting killed.
But all the same baggage is there. And the conflict within the trench serves as a perfect microcosm for everything that's going on. And again, to speak to the whole project we're doing here with going through world history with a series of movies, I think this is a excellent choice that even if it doesn't get into all the details we did, which is setting everything up, it still throws you in the world, and everything we've talked about, even if you as a viewer of this film don't know it, these characters are bringing all that baggage to the table.
Yep.
And it's just heartbreaking in so many ways, and then just frustrating from an intellectual level of why can't we just do better? And I wrote too that the language barrier is actually a major issue here with the UN guy that comes in. We're mostly dealing with French UN members, so the French guy speaks English and French, but he doesn't speak. I don't even know what language are they speaking. Bosnian, Serbian, what's the language that they'd be speaking here? Yugoslavian?
I don't know.
Because the Bosnian and the Serbian both speak the same language, or at least share a language, and so they can communicate with each other. And the Serbian can communicate with the French guy in English. And then you have the English reporter who speaks French and English, so she can communicate with the Serbian. And then there's the German bomb diffuser that comes in, and he only speaks German and English, so he can't talk to the guys who he's trying to save either. And it'd be funny if it wasn't so dire of a situation.
So it looks like the language, there's several names for it. It's a South Slavic language, but it's called Serbo-Croatian or Serbo-Croat or Serbo-Croat Bosnian or Bosnian-Croatian Serbian or Bosnian-Croatian Montenegrin Serbian. So it's basically just this common language that these southern and western countries in what is, the former Yugoslavia is what they speak.
But it doesn't have a common name? It's just this amalgamation of all the groups?
It's called any one of those, and it probably depends on where you're from.
That's so bizarre.
What you call it.
That's so bizarre.
Yeah.
What would they call it in school? If you're going to English class, we would do, yeah.
I wonder if they're those are just the English names. I wonder if they have a name for it.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that is kind of curious. And the only other really note I have here, and we'll get to we'll go ahead and spoil the movie, although I highly recommend everybody watch it. But I think I had been conflating in my mind the term ethnic cleansing with genocide. And yes, genocide can be an aspect of ethnic cleansing, but kind of to what we were talking about with the borders and all of the overlap, basically ethnic cleansing is just tidying all that up. It's oh, you're Serbians in Bosnia, well, we're going to forcibly remove you over to here. And it basically just let's get everybody back on the lines where their side actually belongs. Although that also included, like you said, a lot of killing and genocide, and also a phrase that I was just cringing to read on Wikipedia here, and a phrase I wasn't hoping to ever cross, but systemic mass rape on both sides was an aspect to this. And it doesn't go into any more detail than that, but again, you can just kind of presume it's the whole, I was thinking the Braveheart thing. It's if we can't, get rid of the Scots, we'll breed them out. And basically, and so it's kind of part of that as well, sadly. And again, both sides were guilty of it. It does say mostly the Serbs, which kind of goes to what you're talking about with them being kind of very combative against the UN and NATO. and just kind of, they're like, we're the stronger ones. We're just going to do whatever the heck we want, and no one's going to come in from the outside and say otherwise. They were the ones that seems to like doing most of the ethnic cleansing and the rape. But that's not to say that wasn't going on the other side too.
Right. We're kind of going all over the place topic-wise here, but one of the things that I really liked was in the movie specifically is how the power dynamic changes between the two main guys. So like at the very beginning, like, so the Bosnian has a gun trained on the Serb the whole time. Well, then he ends up kind of catching the other guy, taking advantage of when he's, not really paying attention, and gets a gun and gets him to drop his gun. And then the guy on the ground asks the Serbian guy for like a drink of water or something, and then grabs him and says, all right, you need to drop your gun, and tells the other Bosnian to pick up a gun, or otherwise, I'm going to roll off this mine. It's going to blow us all up. I thought that was like really creative on the part of the writers, how they came up with these totally plausible, totally believable. None of it's contrived. None of it's, Deus Ex Machina. Like, it's all real and earned. And it just that power dynamic shifting back and forth, I thought was really cool.
Yes. So ultimately, again, they're kind of helpless here in the trench. They are trying to communicate to the UN that they need help. UN finally understands what's going on. Of course, the UN's being pestered by the Western media that's trying to just, get the scoop. Any kind of change is the story, and they got their own agenda with, trying to hit deadlines and make, get ratings and all that. And the bomb expert comes in. It's nearing the end of the movie. You're starting to think, okay, finally, we're going to get to this. And then the German bomb expert says, he's screwed. We cannot, the way it's situated with the rock around him and everything, we can't get to the mine. He's already dead, and he doesn't know it yet.
Yeah.
And they're having this discussion right in front of the guy who doesn't speak their language.
Yeah.
Or they're speaking in English, and this guy doesn't speak a word of English, and so he has no idea they've just said he's dead. And then, to hide the fact of all that from the media, they fake it. They basically say, yep, he's saved, and they take basically a fake body. Do they even have a real body? Is it the old guy, maybe?
They grab the guy that got shot to death at the beginning of the movie, the guy who planted the bomb. They pull his body out, and they put a blanket over it, and they say, all right, here's the guy. We're taking him to get help at the hospital.
Yep, you can talk to him later. Okay, everybody, now you better leave. This area's not safe anymore. And then the media actually falls for it. And the cameraman even asked the British journalist, "You want me to go ahead and just like get some B-roll of the trench?" She's like, whatever. You see one trench, you've seen them all. Not realizing the UN was lying, and that guy's still laying there on the mine. If they would have just walked out, they would have noticed that.
Yep.
And the movie ends with a shot from directly above this guy laying on a mine. We don't see him panicking. He doesn't seem to be fully aware what's going on. But at some point, he's got to recognize everybody was here to help me. And now everybody's left, and it's completely silent. That's the end of the movie. I mean, he just, at some point, he will just either just die laying on that mine, or he will roll off and take his chances that on the 1% chance that it's a dud, and he doesn't blow up. But it's kind of the dead man walking, the dead man just laying there, and he's just and the isolation of that is kind of a poignant moment there too.
Yeah.
And we didn't even talk about too, then the two guys that have been fighting this whole time end up killing each other while in UN. They're not in custody per se, but
right. Basically, they're being separated basically to keep them from fighting, I think. And then
right.
The guy pulls out a gun.
They basically both get guns and shoot at each other and kill each other. Yeah.
Yep. Well, the Bosnian guy shoots the Serb, and then one of the French UN guys shoots the Bosnian.
Yeah. It's a mess. But again, it's a really, really good movie.
This is like, when you think about it, and some of them only last for a couple seconds, but like this has quite a few Mexican standoffs in it.
It does, yeah.
Which, as a Tarantino guy.
Oh, yeah, I definitely appreciate. And so we mentioned the movie won Best Foreign Film at the Oscars, and it's a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes on both the audience and the critic side. And the little note here even says, bleak and darkly humorous, No Man's Land vividly illustrates the absurdity of war, which I think, yes, probably a good way to sum it up. It's just a strong, engaging, powerful movie that we highly recommend. Definitely not even, it transcends the whole movie vegetable thing. This is a movie I think you will enjoy, even if it wasn't, quote, one you needed to watch just for its own sake.
Yep. And it's at least the copy that I watched, the subtitles were not hard to read. They were a decent size. They were actually yellow, which I thought was nice. Made it a little easier to read. But it's also sometimes when you watch foreign movies, you'll have foreign actors playing Brits or French or Americans, and they'll have an accent that's maybe a little bit off. But in this movie, like, the Brits are played by Brits, the French are played by French guys, the Bosnians are played by Bosnians. Like, everyone is, the way that they're talking, like, the language barrier is a big deal, but like the German guy's actually German. You know, they kind of went that extra step to make sure that it was authentic.
Yes, it definitely feels authentic, and it has that kind of just international feel to the filmmaking as well. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
So how did this kind of resolve itself? When did kind of the fighting end? And then in these countries are all obviously all autonomous today.
Right. So this conflict specifically, once the bombing started, it kind of turned the tide in favor of the Bosniaks. So all the parties involved, so you had the Bosnian Serbs, the Croats, the Bosniaks, and then the Yugoslav, heads of state all met in Dayton, Ohio, of all places, and had peace talks. And they kept Bosnia-Herzegovina as one country, but it's made up of two different kind of provinces, I guess you would say, or states. One is the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the other one is the Republic of Srpska. So even today, there is still, official boundaries for these two countries, or these two states, but they're both part of the same country. And then as far as Yugoslavia on the whole, the Bosnian War is only the second to last conflict in this area. The last one was the war in Kosovo, which I guess I never really thought about as being different. I honestly thought that like Kosovo and Bosnia were all kind of part of the same conflict, which in a way they kind of are, but they're definitely separate from each other. Kosovo is I guess, depending on how your country views what happened at the end of this conflict, Kosovo either was or is a province of Serbia. It's majority ethnic Albanian. They wanted independence from Serbia, so they wanted independence. Serbia refused. Kosovo was actually backed by NATO in that conflict, so they won the war in 1999, and then in 2008 they declared their independence. However, that conflict is still technically not finalized. It's unresolved because they don't have the international recognition to like be a UN member or anything. Only 108 UN members recognize Kosovo as its own country, which actually, if you look on Google Maps, you can see the border of Kosovo, but it's a dotted line.
Right, because it's not necessarily...
Here's where Kosovo is, but it either, like I said, depending on what country you're in, it either was a province of Serbia or it's now its own country.
Which would be similar to like Taiwan, right?
Yeah, kind of like Taiwan. Or I don't know if we...
There's been others like that, but yeah.
There's a bunch. There's a bunch of places like that all over the world, but yeah.
And so what we really didn't talk about either, though, is we've been kind of focusing, we mentioned those initial 6 parts of Yugoslavia. We've kind of only mentioned, the other ones kind of broke off at different points.
Right. So they broke off at different points throughout this, which we kind of talked about. Slovenia, Croatia had declared independence before Bosnia. Bosnia split apart. Macedonia is now its own country, which is called North Macedonia. And Serbia and Montenegro were the last 2 countries to break apart, and that was in the mid-2000s. And so now... today, all of those 6 countries are, 7.
If you count Kosovo, yeah.
Kosovo, which I'm American, so I do. They're all their own separate countries now. So basically this area that had been, which, sometimes you hear this area called the Balkans or the former Yugoslavia, but basically this part of the world used to be one country altogether, and now it's seven separate countries.
Yeah, and it just had a violent separation that blew up during the 1990s, yes.
Right.
And is mostly stable, I guess, now today, right? Actually, I even saw a video that mentioned that it's like, other than Kosovo being kind of poor, most of them are fine places you can visit, and it's all kind of under control now, yeah. Yeah.
And actually, like, when I was in Afghanistan, like, there are Croatians and Bosnians and Montenegrins, they're all there supporting, like, the ISAF mission. So I think they do get along to a certain extent. But there are definitely, like, even to this day, there are, like, Serbian hardline right-wing people who think that, like, Ratko Mladic is, like, a national hero to them. Mm-hmm. The guy who massacred tens of thousands of people, because, oh, well, they were all Bosnian Muslims. So it's good that he killed them because ethnic cleansing. He was trying to get more for Serbs. So there are still definitely like nationalist sentiments in these areas.
Right. Nothing's ever going to be perfect, right?
Politically, it's right. Politically, it's
stabilized.
It's peaceful.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So hopefully, well, okay, we know that was confusing, but hopefully it wasn't boring. And next week we're going to go for a smaller story that will be much simpler to kind of follow, and we're going to be looking at the right to die, dealing specifically with the film The Sea Inside, starring Javier Bardem.